Buddhist stories and teachings for a contented heart, there is a thought that arrives most reliably in the quiet. Not the busy hours, those are too loud for it to find a foothold. Not the mornings, when the momentum of the day picks you up before you have time to look around, but in moments like this one, in the still of the room, in the small space between the last thing and the dark. The thought comes in different forms. Sometimes it is a calculation, a quiet arithmetic of what was accomplished today against what was intended, and the gap between them. Sometimes it arrives as a face, or a place, or a version of a life not quite arrived at. Sometimes it has no specific object, only a low, persistent signal, like a frequency the mind has been tuned to for so long it no longer notices the sound. Only a sense that somewhere, in some direction not yet traveled, something is waiting that this life has not yet contained. Something more. Most of us carry this thought, the way we carry a stone in our shoe, not crippling, not demanding to be addressed, but present with every step, a small discomfort that colors the walk without quite ruining it. For centuries, Buddhist teachers have sat with this particular discomfort. They have looked at it carefully, the way they look at most things, without judgment, without the urgency to resolve it, with the particular patience of people who have decided that what a thing actually is matters more than what we have assumed it to be, and what they found in the looking surprised them, not because it was complicated, because it was so simple. The thing that feels missing, they found, is not missing. It has never been missing. It was here before the thought of it arrived, and it is here now, and it will be here in the morning. It does not require acquisition or achievement or a different set of circumstances. The first bowl, it turns out, was already perfect. Tonight, we will sit with 5 old stories about this discovery, about people who reached for more and found, in the reaching, something they had not expected, about the particular exhaustion of a life organized around the next thing, and the particular rest that becomes available when the next thing is allowed for one quiet evening to wait. What you already have is already enough. We will explore what that means together. Welcome to all of you who are here tonight. To those who have found this place before, it is good to have you back. To those who are here for the first time, you arrived at exactly the right moment, which is always now. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you are listening from. Perhaps the day was full, and you are grateful to have reached this end of it. Perhaps the day was quiet, and the quiet somehow made the restlessness louder. Either way, you are welcome exactly as you arrived, without needing to be further along, further ahead, or further anything at all. What you bring to this moment is sufficient, more than sufficient. We will sit with that together. There is a particular kind of hunger that has nothing to do with food. You can be warm and sheltered and surrounded by people who care for you and still feel it. You can have more than most people on this earth. More comfort, more safety, more of the things that people list when they describe a good life, and still carry the sensation that something essential is missing, that the life you are in is slightly adjacent to the life you were meant for. That there is a room you have not yet entered, a version of yourself not yet reached, a threshold not yet crossed. This hunger is not a personal failure. It is not evidence of ingratitude or selfishness. It is, in fact, something built into the very structure of the thinking mind. Buddhist teachers called it tanha, a Pali word often translated as craving, or thirst, or want. But the most accurate translation might simply be the assumption that what is here is not quite enough, and that what is there, just ahead, just around the corner, just after this next thing, will be. Tanha is the experience of always living slightly in the future, of being present enough to function, but not quite present enough to arrive, of being, in some fundamental way, always on the way to something rather than actually there. The difficulty, and every teacher who has looked at this carefully has noted it with a kind of gentle humor, is that the thing tanha promises, it cannot deliver, because the moment you reach the thing you were reaching for, tanha simply relocates. It moves the threshold, it adjusts the horizon, it offers a new next thing with the same reliability it offered the last one. The horizon, of course, is not a place you can arrive at. It is a relationship between the eye and the sky. It moves because you move. It will always be the same distance away. Tonight's stories are about people who discovered this, not through lecture or philosophy or years of practice, but in the ordinary moments when life offered them something extra and they found, to their surprise, that the extra changed nothing essential, that the first bowl had already been enough, that the garden at its original size had already been the garden, that the wealth they had been searching for was, somehow, already in their hands. We will go slowly. There is no rush. Let us begin. Let us explore a story about a monk who was given a second bowl and discovered that the first one had always been perfect. His name was Brother Tenzin, and he had lived in a small mountain monastery for 19 years, which was long enough to have made peace with most things. He had made peace with the cold winters which arrived early and left late and showed no particular interest in the comfort of the monks who lived through them. He had made peace with the sparse meals, rice and vegetables, and occasionally something dried that he could not always identify, which were served once in the morning and once at midday, with nothing after that until the following dawn. He had made peace with the hard, narrow bed, the long silences, the hour of manual labor each morning that the abbot insisted on because, he said, a monk who does not know his hands does not know himself. He had made peace with solitude, with uncertainty, with the particular loneliness of a spiritual path that promised nothing except the opportunity to keep walking. What Brother Tenzin had not quite made peace with, what sat just at the edge of his contentment like a small stone in a comfortable room, was his bowl. It was, by any reasonable measure, a perfectly adequate bowl. Dark clay, slightly irregular at the rim, the imperfection of something made by hand rather than machine, with a small hairline crack near the base that had been there so long it had become part of the bowl's character rather than a flaw. It held food. It held warmth. It had accompanied him through 19 years of meals without failing once. And yet, there was a monk in the Eastern Hall who had a bowl of smooth, polished wood that caught the morning light in a way that Tenzin's clay bowl never did. There was another monk, a newcomer barely 3 years in, whose family had sent a bowl of dark stone that made a particular low sound when the ladle struck it at meal times, a sound like a small bell, a sound that Tenzin heard 3 times a day and found, against his will, mildly enviable. He did not dwell on this. He was not a man who dwelled, but it was there, the slight awareness of his bowl against other bowls, the way his eye moved at mealtimes, the small unconscious comparison. In Tenzin's 20th year at the monastery, a delegation of monks arrived from a larger community 3 days' walk to the east. They came for a joint retreat and brought gifts, as was customary for the host monastery, and for the monks themselves, 20 new bowls, 1 each, fired in the lowland kilns the Eastern monastery was famous for. They were beautiful bowls, a warm red clay, smooth and even, weighted in a way that felt correct in the hands. When filled with rice, they held the heat longer than stone or wood. Each monk of the host community received one. Brother Tenzin stood in the courtyard holding his new bowl and looked at it for a long time. It was, he thought, genuinely lovely. He took it to his room. He set it on the low shelf beside his bed, next to the old clay bowl. He looked at them together, the old with its cracked base and irregular rim, the new with its smooth warmth and perfect weight. He ate his midday meal from the new bowl and noticed that, yes, it held the heat as described. It sat well in his palms. That evening, a question arrived that he had not expected: what to do with the old bowl. He could not give it away. It was cracked. He could not simply throw it away, which felt wrong in a way he could not immediately articulate, but which arrived as a physical sensation rather than a thought, a slight resistance in the chest. He sat with the old bowl in his hands, and as he sat with it, in the early evening quiet, in the particular quality of monastery light that comes when the sun has left the mountains, but the sky has not yet gone dark, he looked at it, really looked at it, with the attention of someone who has decided that what a thing actually is matters more than what he assumed it to be, the crack near the base. He had stopped seeing it years ago. It had become invisible the way familiar things become invisible, but now he traced it with one finger. It ran from the left side of the base in a gentle arc, terminating a centimeter short of the rim. He thought about the Japanese practice of repairing cracked ceramics with gold, the break made visible and celebrated rather than hidden, because the crack is part of the object's history, and the history is what gives it value. He had not filled this bowl with gold, but the crack was there, the specific crack of this specific bowl that had traveled through 19 years of his specific life. He thought about the meals, not individually. He could not remember individual meals from 19 years, but in aggregate, the way you might remember a long journey, not by its individual steps, but by the texture of the whole. The cold mornings when the rice had been the warmest thing in the room, The summer meals eaten in the courtyard when the bowl had sat in his lap, and the light had come down through the trees in a particular way he associated with a feeling of unusual peace. The evening he had received difficult news and had sat holding the bowl empty after the meal was finished, simply because it was something to hold. The bowl had been there for all of it, not observing, not passive, there, the way a companion is there, present in the background of important moments unremarked upon, because so constant, so reliable, so simply always in place. Tenzin set the old bowl back on the shelf. He used both bowls after that. The new one for formal meals, the old one for the solitary evening tea he had developed the habit of making in his room in winter. But something had changed in his relationship with the old bowl, or rather, something had been restored that he had not known he had lost. He had stopped seeing it, and in the seeing of it again, in the moment when he had actually looked, with the attention usually reserved for things that are new or important, or at risk of being lost, he had found something that had been there for 19 years, without announcing itself. The first bowl had always been perfect, not in spite of the crack, not merely despite the irregular rim, but as itself, as this object, with this history, held by these hands through these particular years. The second bowl was lovely. He was glad to have it, but it had not added what he thought it would add, because there had been nothing missing to fill. Let us pause here for a moment. What is the bowl you stopped seeing? What is the thing so familiar, so constant, so reliably present in the background of your life that it has become invisible? Not because it is gone, but because you stopped looking. It is still there. It has been there through many more of your important moments than you have remembered to notice. When you are ready, we will continue together. Let us explore a story about a man who traveled a long way to ask a question and found the answer waiting before he arrived. His name was Merchant Fan, and he had spent 40 years acquiring things, not recklessly, not wastefully. He was a methodical man, and the things he acquired were acquired methodically. The trading routes built one by one over 2 decades, the warehouses in 4 cities, each added when the previous one was full. The house in the valley, then the larger house, then the largest house, which was so large that he had rooms he had never entered, and corridors he was not certain he had correctly mapped. A wife who had loved him with great loyalty for 30 years, and who had, in those 30 years, watched his attention drift increasingly toward the next thing, and away from the thing they already had. Children who were kind and accomplished, and who sent letters he did not always find time to answer. He was not, by any measure that his world recognized, an unhappy man. He was successful. He was respected. He had built something from very little, and yet the feeling had been with him for so long that he had almost stopped noticing it. Almost. It arrived in the evenings, after the accounts were reviewed, and the correspondence answered, and the decisions made, and the plans confirmed. In the silence at the end of a productive day, there it was. The sense that something essential was unaccounted for. the persistent, almost mathematical feeling that the columns added up to a sum that should have been larger than it was. In his 61st year, Fan heard about a teacher. He heard about her the way one hears about certain things, from a traveler passing through, who had heard it from someone in a northern province, who had met a monk who had studied with her for 3 years, and come back changed in a way that was difficult to describe, but immediately visible. The teacher lived in a small community in the foothills, 3 weeks' journey to the north. She was very old. She saw visitors rarely, and only when she chose to. Fan organized the journey. Provisions, guides. 3 weeks of travel through increasingly unfamiliar terrain. He arrived at the small community on a Tuesday afternoon, dusty and tired in the particular way of long travel that is not unpleasant, a tiredness with no urgency in it. In the morning, he was brought to a garden. The garden was small, a square of raked gravel, 3 old plum trees, a low stone bench along one wall. The teacher was already there when he arrived, sitting on the bench with her hands in her lap. She was very old, the kind of old that has stopped being distinguishable by decades and simply is the way a mountain simply is. Her eyes were sharp and unhurried. He had prepared his question carefully. 40 years of feeling that something was missing. The specific texture of the dissatisfaction. The fact that more had never helped. He opened his mouth to begin. The teacher said, "You feel that you are not satisfied, that you have enough, and it does not feel like enough. That the more you have, the more distant the feeling of enough becomes." Fan closed his mouth. "You have not asked this yet," the teacher said mildly. "I am simply telling you what you came to ask, so we do not use our time arriving at the question." Fan looked at her. "That is exactly the question," he said. She nodded. She looked at the plum trees, old trees, gnarled and patient, carrying in their structure the memory and promise of every blossom they had ever produced or would produce. "Tell me," the teacher said, "what you felt when you arrived here yesterday." Fan thought. "Tired," he said, "and quiet. Quieter than I have been in some time. And this morning, when you walked through the garden to reach me," he thought about the walk, the raked gravel, the particular quality of morning light in the mountains, the sound of something, water perhaps, that he had not seen but had heard. "Present," he said slowly. He was surprised to say this. He had not known it was true until the word arrived. "Yes," the teacher said. "And did you feel that anything was missing in those moments?" Fan was quiet for a long time. He cast his memory back across the walk, through the garden, the crunch of gravel, the light, the sound of water. Had the dissatisfaction been there? It had not. "No," he said, "I didn't." The teacher looked at him with the quality of attention of someone who has been looking at things carefully for a very long time. "Satisfaction," she said, "is not a destination. It is not something you arrive at by adding more to what you have. It is a quality of attention. It is what becomes available when you are actually here, not calculating, not comparing, not measuring. Here, as you were on the walk, as you were last evening, tired from the road, She paused. The hunger you have been trying to feed is not a hunger for things. It is a hunger for presence, and presence cannot be acquired. It can only be arrived at. Again and again, each time, the mind wanders away from where you actually are. Fan sat with this. He had traveled 3 weeks for this. He was, if he was honest, slightly disappointed. Not by the teacher, but by the answer, which was smaller than he had hoped. He said as much. The teacher smiled. It was the smile of someone who has heard this before. You want a more complicated answer, because a complicated answer would take longer to arrive at. And while you were arriving at it, you would be occupied, moving toward something. She looked at him. But you are already here. Fan walked back to his room through the garden. The gravel, the light, different now, the morning having advanced, the sound of water. He stayed at the small community for 3 days instead of the one he had planned. On the morning of the 4th day, he began the journey home. He had not acquired anything. He had not received a system or a set of practices to implement. He had only been for 3 days present. For 3 days, the feeling of unaccounted for sum had not arrived in the evenings. For 3 days, the columns had seemed to add up correctly. He was aware, on the road home, that the feeling would likely return. That presence was not a destination, that he would need to arrive at it again and again. But he also knew something he had not known before the journey, that it was possible, that the feeling of enough was not in the next acquisition, or the one after that, or the life that waited on the other side of the next threshold. It was here, in the gravel, in the light, in the sound of water he could still, if he was quiet enough, almost hear. Let us pause here for a moment. Where are you right now? Not tomorrow, not the version of today that didn't quite happen as planned. Here, in this specific room, in this specific moment, in this body that has carried you through an entire day and is now, finally, allowed to rest. The feeling is not somewhere ahead. It is available right now in exactly the proportions that this moment contains. When you are ready, we will continue together. Let us explore a story about a gardener who kept expanding and what he found when he finally stopped. His name was Old Ving, and he had been gardening for more than 50 years. He had begun at 12 when his mother gave him a small plot beside the family's house. Perhaps 3 paces by 4, a rectangle of dark earth against the south-facing wall where the light was generous and the soil had been enriched by 50 years of leaves and kitchen scraps. She handed him a trowel and some seeds and said, "Here, see what you can do with this." He had taken to it in the way some people take to things. Not with immediate mastery, but with a quality of attention that made mastery feel, over time, like an inevitability. He learned the soil. He learned the light, how it moved through the day, how it changed with the seasons, which corners warmed earliest and which stayed cool. He learned the particular language of his plants, which was mostly a language of color and posture. The slight droop that meant water, the yellowing that meant something in the soil, the particular way a plant held itself when it was thriving versus merely surviving. By the time he was 30, the original 3x4 plot had grown to fill the entire south-facing side of the family property. By 40, he had acquired the narrow strip on the east side as well. By 50, the garden was considerable. He employed 2 young men part-time to help with the heavy work. He had built a small shed for tools and divided the garden into zones. Vegetables here, herbs there, a small section of flowers that he told himself was purely practical and that he knew, if he was honest, he had included because he simply found them beautiful. It was, by anyone's assessment, an impressive garden. And at 55, when a neighboring property came up for sale, a full half-acre that had been left largely unworked for a decade, Vin bought it. He was not entirely certain why. The question arrived a few nights after the purchase, lying in bed in the small hours. The existing garden produced more vegetables than his family could eat. He did not need more garden, and yet the land had been available, and he had wanted it. By the 4th year of the expanded garden, Vin was spending 12 hours a day in it, always moving, to this bed that needed attention, to the irrigation that needed adjusting, to the corner where the new apple trees were establishing themselves. He was occupied from the first light to the last, and he had stopped sitting. This was the thing he had forgotten. He had always sat. In the years before the half-acre, he had spent some portion of each day simply sitting in the garden, not working, not planning, not assessing what needed to be done next, just sitting in whatever spot seemed right that day, and being in the garden the way you can only be in a place when you are not trying to do anything with it. He had sat and watched how the bees moved through the squash flowers in a pattern he had never fully mapped but could feel the logic of. He had sat in the herb section in the evenings and let the specific combination of smells, rosemary and mint, and the green damp smell of well-watered earth, do whatever it did to him, which had something to do with the sensation of being exactly where he should be. He could not sit now. There was too much to tend. The garden that had grown too large had become, without his noticing, a garden he was managing rather than a garden he was in. He walked it one evening in late summer, the full circuit, from the oldest south-facing beds through the herb sections to the new half-acre, and he looked at it. The new plantings were doing well. The beds were properly maintained. It was a good garden, and he was tired in a way that sleep did not entirely resolve. He sat down just for a moment, because there was always something waiting, on an old bench beside the herb section. The bench had been there for 30 years. Its wood had gone grey and soft with weather, and it was slightly uneven on the ground, and it was the most comfortable bench he had ever sat on. He had not sat on it in 4 years. He sat now. The evening was warm. The herbs were giving off their particular combination of smells, rosemary and mint and the green damp, and a bee confused about the hour was making a final disoriented circuit of the lavender. He sat for a long time, and what arrived in the sitting, not as a thought but as a felt thing, a body knowledge rather than a conclusion, was simple. The garden had always been this. The smell, the light, the particular quality of sitting, in a place that had been tended with care over many years, and had responded by becoming, over those years, more itself. This was what the garden was. This was what it had always been, from the original 3x4 rectangle against the south wall. He had expanded in order to have more of this, and in expanding, he had made it impossible to be in this. The following spring, Vin let the half-acre go back to a neighbor's son who wanted to learn to farm. He reduced, and the reduction felt at first like loss, and then it felt like finding something he had mislaid. He began sitting again, an hour each morning, an hour each evening, simply in the garden, not working, not planning. Just there, the bees and their incomprehensible logic, the herbs in the evening, the grey bench that was still, reliably, the most comfortable bench he had ever sat on. The garden was smaller. It was also, somehow, larger than it had ever been. Let us pause here for a moment. Is there something in your life that you have expanded in the hope of having more of something, and found that the expansion made the thing itself harder to reach? The schedule that has no room in it, the life that is full, but somehow not quite inhabited. What was the original garden? What was the thing before it grew too large to sit in? When you are ready, we will continue together. Let us explore a story about a river and a young monk who spent a long time asking it the wrong question. Brother Tao came to the river every morning for 3 years. This was part of his assigned practice. The abbot had given it to him after an interview in which Tao had described his difficulties. He found sitting meditation uncomfortable. His mind, when given nothing to look at, produced an extraordinary amount of content. He found chanting useful, but not in the way it was supposed to be useful. He found the texts interesting, sometimes fascinating, in the way that very engaging problems are fascinating, which the abbot said was not quite the point. The abbot had thought for a moment. Then he said, "Go to the river each morning. Sit beside it. Stay as long as you can. Do not try to meditate. Just be there." Tao was 22 and had the energy of someone who has recently decided that spiritual development is the most important project available. He went to the river the following morning with a journal, a set of texts, and considerable intention. He sat down beside the river. It was a mountain river, fast and cold and opinionated, running over and among a particular arrangement of boulders that produced a sound unlike water anywhere else, a combination of the high, light sound of water over flat rock and the deeper resonance of water moving through a gap between two large stones, producing a kind of bass note underneath the treble, a sound with unexpected complexity. Tao opened his journal. He wrote, "The river is fast, cold. There is a specific sound. I will investigate its spiritual meaning." He looked at the river for a while, trying to determine its spiritual meaning. The river did not offer one. He tried, over the weeks that followed, various frameworks for understanding what the river was teaching him. He read about rivers in the texts he had brought, and about water as metaphor. He tried to extract instruction. The river, for its part, simply ran. 6 months into his practice by the river, Tao arrived one morning and found that a tree had fallen in the night, one of the old pines that lined the bank upstream, and had come down across the river at an angle. The river was handling this. It had not panicked. It had not stalled. It had simply rearranged itself, the way water always rearranges itself around whatever appears in its path. The current still moved. Different paths had opened on either side of the trunk. The sound had changed, but the river was there, moving, adapting, doing what the river does. Tao sat and watched this for a long time. He forgot his journal. He forgot the texts. He forgot the question he had been trying to answer for 6 months, which was, what is the river trying to teach me? He simply watched. And something arrived that was not a thought, or not exactly a thought, more like a recognition. The kind of thing that does not feel like learning something new, but like remembering something that was known before the knowing. The river did not need anything. This sounds simple. It is simple. But Tao sat with it for a long time because its simplicity contained something he had been moving around for 6 months without touching. The river was not organized around having certain things and lacking others. It was organized around being exactly what it was, in exactly the conditions it found itself in, without reserve. It did not measure itself against a previous configuration and find the current one wanting. It moved through what was here completely, and in the moving it was, moment by moment, entirely sufficient. Tao went back to the abbot. I think, he said carefully, I understand what the river is. The abbot waited. It is not teaching me anything, Tao said. Or, it is teaching me something, but not by having a lesson. It is teaching me by being completely what it is. It doesn't need anything to be added to it. It just moves through what is here. Yes, the abbot said. And Tao sat with the and for a moment. And I have been sitting beside it for 6 months, trying to extract something from it, he said, instead of just being beside it, the abbot said. Yes, go back tomorrow, the abbot said, but leave the journal. Tao went back without the journal. He went back the following morning and the morning after that for another 2.5 years. He sat beside the river in spring when it was swollen and brown with snow melt, and in summer when it ran low and clear, and in autumn when the leaves came down and the river carried them in spinning clusters toward wherever the river was going. He did not need the river to be different from what it was. And in not needing this, he discovered, slowly, the way river lessons always arrive, that he did not need himself to be different from what he was either, that the qualities he had been measuring against some imagined better version, the restless mind, the difficulty sitting, the tendency to reach for frameworks and extract meaning. These were not flaws to be corrected before the real work could begin. They were his river, moving through what was here. Let us pause here for a moment. What are you adding to yourself tonight that you believe is missing? What achievement or arrival would make you sufficient in the way you are not quite sufficient now? The river does not ask this question. It moves through what is here. Perhaps for this evening, you might also. When you are ready, we will continue together. let us explore a story about an old woman who had almost nothing and was, by every measure that mattered, the wealthiest person anyone who knew her had ever met. Her name was Grandmother Lan, and she was 92 years old, and she lived in 2 rooms. This was not always the case. She had, at various points in her long life, lived in more rooms than 2. She had lived with a husband who had died 30 years ago quietly, in the good way that some people die, in their sleep, in their own bed, with the sound of the garden outside the window. She had lived with children who were grown now and settled in cities she visited infrequently. Now she lived in 2 rooms, and she had distilled her possessions to exactly what fit in those rooms without crowding them. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, a small stove, shelves with the books she still read, which she continued to cull. When a book no longer interested her, she gave it away. A window that faced the garden, which she tended herself despite being 92, because the tending was one of the things that made the days feel like hers. Her granddaughter came to visit in the late summer of Grandmother Lan's 92nd year. The granddaughter was 28, an age of significant uncertainty. The career she had built was going well by objective measures, and felt subjectively like a question she had not finished answering. The relationship she was in was good by most measures, and yet she found herself wondering, sometimes at night, whether it was good enough. She owned an apartment and a car, and more things than she could easily inventory. And she was, frequently, mildly dissatisfied, in a way she did not know how to address. She had come to visit her grandmother, partly from affection, and partly from something less defined, a need to be somewhere that felt settled. They sat in the garden on the 2nd afternoon of the visit. The garden was small and tended with the precision of someone who has been doing this for a long time and has arrived at the understanding that a small garden tended well is more than sufficient. Grandmother Lan grew herbs and a few flowers and 1 plum tree that produced, in the right years, more plums than she and her visitors could eat. They drank tea. "Tell me what you are worried about," Grandmother Lan said, without preamble. Her granddaughter looked at her. "Who said I was worried? You arrived with 3 bags for 4 days," the grandmother said. "And you have been looking at things the way you look at things when you are deciding whether they are sufficient." Her granddaughter felt, as she often felt in this presence, both seen and slightly embarrassed. "Am I that obvious?" "Only to me," the grandmother said, in a tone that made it clear this was meant kindly. So the granddaughter told her. The career question, the relationship question, the inventory of things that did not quite add up to the feeling she had expected to have by now. Grandmother Lan listened without interruption. She listened the way the river listens, without judgment, without the urgency to respond, with her full attention available for whatever arrived. When the granddaughter finished, there was a quiet. Then the grandmother said, "What do you think you are missing?" Her granddaughter thought, "I don't know exactly. That's part of the problem. It's not a specific thing. It's more like a feeling that I should be further along, that things should feel more settled than they do." That I should feel, she paused, enough. That I should feel enough. Grandmother Lan was quiet for a moment. I am going to tell you something that I could not have told you at 28, because at 28 I did not know it. I learned it somewhere in my 50s, which was when I had enough distance from the feeling to actually see it. The garden was very still. The plum tree held its late summer leaves, heavy with the last weeks of light. The feeling that you are not enough, the grandmother said, is not information about whether you are enough. It is information about the mind's habit of measuring. That is all. The mind measures. This is what minds do. They compare, they calculate, they notice the gap between what is and what the mind has decided should be, and then they report the gap as though the gap were a fact about reality rather than a fact about measurement. She paused. You are not behind. There is nowhere to be behind in relation to. The life you are in is the only race being run, and you are the only runner, and there is no finish line with a clock above it. Her granddaughter looked at the garden, the herbs small and various, the flowers, the plum tree. How do you do it? She asked. Feel settled. The way you seem settled. Grandmother Lan considered this. I stopped measuring, not all at once, and not forever. The measurement still comes sometimes because minds are stubborn. But I began to notice when it was happening, and I would say to myself, this is measurement. This is not truth. And then I would look at whatever was actually here. She gestured at the garden. 2 rooms. This garden, the tea, the plum tree. This afternoon, she looked at her granddaughter. You. She was quiet. This is an enormous amount. When I stop measuring and simply look, this is an enormous, extraordinary, completely sufficient amount. They sat together for a long time after that, in the garden, while the afternoon light moved through the plum tree, in the way that afternoon light moves through plum trees in late summer. They did not say much more. They did not need to. When the granddaughter left 2 days later, she stood at the door of the 2 rooms and looked at her grandmother. Thank you, she said, meaning it in more directions than the visit. Grandmother Lan smiled. Come back in spring, she said. The plums will be early this year. The granddaughter thought about her grandmother's garden for a long time on the journey home. The 2 rooms, the herbs, the plum tree, the absolute sufficiency of it all, not the sufficiency of limitation or resignation, but the sufficiency of a person who had stopped measuring and found, in the stopping, that what was here was more than she had known how to see. She had seen what enough looks like when you stop measuring. Let us pause here for a moment. If you stopped measuring tonight, stopped calculating the gap between what is and what should be, what would you find here in this room, in this moment? Not compared to anything, not assessed against any version of a life further along. Only this, only here, only already enough. When you are ready, we will continue together. 5 stories, 5 different people, 1 discovery arriving through 5 different doors. Brother Tenzin, who held the old bowl in his hands in the evening light and found, in the actual looking, that it had been there through 19 years of his most important moments, that it was cracked in a specific way that was also the record of a specific life. That the second bowl was lovely and had not added what he imagined it would add, because there had been nothing missing to fill. Merchant Farn, who traveled 3 weeks through increasingly unfamiliar terrain to ask a question, and found the answer waiting in the gravel and the morning light and the sound of water, present, simply present, in the moments when he was not measuring. The satisfaction was not in the destination, it was in the arrival. And arrival is available anywhere, at any moment, when the mind consents to be where the body already is. Old Ving, who expanded his garden in the hope of having more of what the garden gave him, and discovered that the expanding had made it impossible to be in the garden in the way that mattered, that the original 3x4 rectangle against the south wall had already contained everything the garden ever was, that reducing was not loss. It was the return of something he had not known he had given away. Brother Dao, who sat beside the river for 3 years, and finally arrived at the understanding that the river did not need anything added to it, that it moved through what was here completely, without measuring itself against a previous configuration, that his own restless mind and his tendency to reach for frameworks were not flaws to be corrected before the real work could begin. They were his river, already moving, already enough. Grandmother Lan, who lived in 2 rooms and a garden, and had stopped measuring, and found in the stopping that what was here was an enormous, extraordinary, completely sufficient amount. Who could look at the afternoon light in the plum tree and her granddaughter sitting across from her with tea, and know, without calculation, without comparison, that this was wealth? What they all found is the same thing. Enough is not a quantity. It is not a threshold you cross when the accumulation reaches a certain point. It is not waiting at the end of the next project, or the conclusion of the next phase, or the arrival of the next milestone. Enough is what becomes available when the measuring stops. Not permanently, not forever. Minds return to measurement the way water returns to its level. But in the pausing, in the moment when the calculation is interrupted by actual presence, by the bowl actually looked at, the garden actually sat in, the river actually watched without the journal, in that moment, what is here reveals itself. And what is here, it turns out, has always been here, patient and complete, and making no demands, waiting the way Grandmother Lan's garden waited, for the attention that allows it to be seen. The first bowl was already perfect. The original garden was already the garden. The river already had everything the river needs. You already have everything you need for this moment. Not for tomorrow, not for the year ahead, not for the version of the life not yet arrived at. For this moment, this room, this breath, this particular quality of tired that comes at the end of a day fully lived. This is enough, more than enough, an extraordinary amount. So let us rest now with that. Let the body settle into wherever it has already arranged itself, because the body is wise about these things and has probably already found the right position while the mind was busy with the stories. The shoulders, perhaps, can let go of a little of whatever they have been holding. Not forced. Nothing here is forced. Only the faint permission of noticing that holding is optional, and that the night does not require anything to be held up. The breath comes and goes. You do not have to improve it. You do not have to breathe in any particular way or at any particular depth. The breath has been doing this since before you were old enough to have opinions about it. It will continue while you sleep reliably without your supervision. Let it. And the thoughts, they may come. They often do at this hour, with their calculations and their comparisons and their quiet insistence that something is unfinished. They can be met the way Merchant Fan met the garden, not with argument, not with another calculation to answer the calculation, but with the simple observation. Ah, measurement. There it is, doing what measurement does, and then, perhaps, returning to what is actually here, which is this room, this temperature, the specific quality of the dark, the weight of the covers or the floor or the chair, the breath steady and unhurried, the bowl that has been with you through many important moments, ordinary and therefore invisible and still here, the garden at its original size, the river moving through what is here. You are not behind. There is nowhere to be behind in relation to. The life you are in is the only one being lived, and you are in it right now, and right now is the whole of what is available to anyone at any moment. This is already enough. More than enough. An enormous amount. Thank you for spending this time here tonight, for traveling through 5 old stories with the particular patience that evening allows, for bringing your questions and your tiredness and your measuring mind to a place that does not require any of it to be different than it is. You arrived exactly right. You are leaving into sleep, into whatever rest this night holds, exactly right. Sleep well. And thank you for joining us here at Quiet Lotus Sleep.